Imagine disappearing so completely that more than 40 years after your body is found, you're still known only by a case number. It isn't a mystery about a suspect or a murder weapon. In fact, investigators can't even say for certain that a crime was committed. What they do know is that an unidentified man was found in a New Jersey marsh, and for more than 4 decades, they've been trying to answer one simple question: who was he? On May 14, 1982, a local clamor was working in a marshy area of Brigantine City, New Jersey, when he came across human skeletal remains. There was no identification. What investigators could determine was limited. The remains appeared to belong to a white man who was probably between 35 and 45 years old. He was estimated to have been about 5 feet 6 inches tall and to have weighed around 165 pounds. And that's about where the certainty ends. Investigators believe he died sometime between 1981 and 1982, but even that is an estimate. With skeletal remains, especially those exposed to water and the elements, establishing an exact timeline can be extremely difficult. Environmental conditions can change how quickly remains deteriorate, which means there's no simple way to look at a skeleton and say he died exactly this long ago. So the man became an unidentified person, and he stayed that way. The location where he was found is part of what makes the case so difficult to picture. Brigantine is a barrier island just north of Atlantic City. It's known for beaches, summer visitors, and the kind of coastal development you'd expect along the Jersey Shore. But away from the beaches, there's another side to the island. Tidal wetlands stretch across parts of the bayside, including an area known as Golden Hammock Thoroughfare. It's a network of shallow waterways and marshland where the landscape changes with the tides. That's where this man's remains were discovered. And after investigators recovered them, they had a problem that would become painfully familiar over the next 44 years. They knew who the remains belonged to in the most basic sense: an adult man. But they had no name to put beside him. There was no identification that could immediately point detectives toward a family. No obvious connection to a missing person case. Nothing that could tell investigators where he had lived or what had brought him to Brigantine. The case was investigated, but eventually it went cold. That doesn't necessarily mean someone stopped caring. It's what happens to many unidentified remains cases. Investigators reach the limits of the information and technology available to them, and the evidence gets preserved in the hope that something will eventually change. For this man, that something took decades. The technology available in 1982 simply wasn't what it is today. DNA profiling was not yet the investigative tool it would become. There were no modern national systems capable of making the kind of comparisons investigators can make now. So the remains stayed unidentified. The case was still there, sitting in the background, waiting for another look. And eventually investigators took that look. Lieutenant Jay Glasser of the Brigantine Police Department has explained that the department has returned to the case several times over the years, particularly as forensic technology has improved. The department revisited it again in 2022 and later worked with the New Jersey State Police Missing Persons Unit on forensic imaging. That work produced a face, something investigators had never had before. A forensic facial reconstruction based on the man's remains and the information investigators have about him. It isn't meant to show exactly what he looked like. There are limits to what can be reconstructed from a skull, and details such as his exact eye color or the way he wore his hair can't simply be recovered from bone. But for the first time, investigators could put an approximation of his face in front of the public. With a face, someone might look at that reconstruction and suddenly think of a relative they haven't seen in decades. A man from a family photograph, someone who disappeared around the same time and was never found. That's what investigators are hoping for. The facial images were released while DNA testing on the remains was still ongoing. According to Lieutenant Glasser, the sketch was ready before the latest DNA work had produced an identification, so police decided there was no reason to wait before asking the public for help. So far, that hasn't produced the answer. There have been people offering assistance, but investigators have not reported a tip that has fully identified the man. And there's another important point here. Nothing in the publicly available information establishes that this man was murdered. There is no confirmed cause of death that has been publicly released, and no suspect has been identified. Investigators have not presented the case as a confirmed homicide. That leaves us with a much wider range of possibilities. Could he have died accidentally or from natural causes? There could have been foul play as well, but at this point we simply don't know. The fact that a person's remains are found in an isolated location doesn't automatically tell us how they got there. All we know is that this man died sometime around 1981 or 1982, and his remains were discovered in Brigantine in May 1982. Everything else has to be treated as a question. Even the circumstances surrounding his death remain unclear, and that's what makes this case different from a lot of the stories we cover. There's no killer to identify, no crime scene to be reconstructed with confidence, and no motive to examine. Before investigators can determine what happened to this man, they first have to figure out who he was. And after 44 years, that is still the biggest question. There is, however, one reason not to give up on a case like this. We've seen unidentified remains solved after decades. In fact, another New Jersey case connected to the same general stretch of coastline was solved in 2025. Between 1995 and 2013, human remains were found in pieces on beaches in Longport, Margate, and Ocean City. For years, investigators couldn't determine who they belonged to. Eventually, New Jersey State Police worked with researchers and students from Ramapo College's Investigative Genetic Genealogy Center. The remains were ultimately identified as Henry Goodsell, the captain of the schooner Oriental, which sank off Brigantine Shoal in 1844. Genetic genealogy and historical research helped connect the remains to Goodsell, and a DNA sample from a living descendant confirmed the identification. That case had been unresolved for generations. And then suddenly the man had a name again. That's the part worth remembering here. A cold case isn't necessarily a dead case. Sometimes the evidence simply has to wait for the right technology. The unidentified man found in Brigantine has already waited more than 40 years. He has a forensic reconstruction now. He has investigators who are still working the case. And he has DNA evidence that is still being processed using modern techniques. What he doesn't have is a name that would bring all of this together. We don't know whether he lived in New Jersey or somewhere much farther away. We don't know whether he had children, siblings, parents, or anyone else who spent years wondering what happened to him. We can't say that nobody reported him missing. It's entirely possible that somewhere, sometime around 1981 or 1982, someone did exactly that. Maybe the report was never connected to his remains. Maybe the records didn't survive in a form that made the connection possible. Or maybe the people who knew him simply never realized where he had gone. Nevertheless, those are possibilities, not facts. And after 44 years, that's still the frustrating reality of this case, with unanswered questions such as, who was this man? Why was he in Brigantine? How did he die? And why has nobody recognized him? Investigators are still hoping that one of those questions can finally lead to the others, because somewhere there may be a family with an empty space in an old photograph and a story about someone who disappeared around 1981 or 1982. There may be a name sitting in an old missing person file that has never been connected to this man's remains. And there may be someone alive today who sees the reconstruction and thinks, I know that face. Until that happens, he remains what investigators have called him for decades, an unidentified man from Brigantine.